There is a sentence that arrives, almost inevitably, somewhere near the end of a relationship with someone avoidant, delivered gently, sometimes even tearfully, as though it were a genuine gift being offered, rather than a carefully constructed exit. Can we still be friends? 4 words that sound generous on the surface, sound mature, sound like proof that whatever existed between you was real enough to preserve in some smaller form. And if you have heard those words, or sense they might be coming, I want you to listen closely to everything that follows, because underneath that gentle-sounding offer sits something considerably more complicated, something that deserves to be understood clearly before you agree to anything at all. Let's start with what this offer actually accomplishes for them, because understanding function matters more than understanding the words themselves. When an avoidant person proposes friendship immediately following a romantic ending, especially one they initiated or one shaped significantly by their own withdrawal, this proposal frequently serves a very specific psychological purpose: preserving access without preserving obligation. Romantic relationships, at least the healthy ones, come bundled with expectations: consistency, emotional availability, accountability for impact. Friendship, particularly the loosely defined, low commitment version typically being offered here, comes with none of these built-in requirements. This means the transition from partner to friend often represents, functionally, a downgrade in what they owe you, while frequently preserving much of what they still receive from you: attention, warmth, emotional labor, the comfort of your continued presence in their life. Let's talk about why this arrangement can feel so disorienting in the moment it gets proposed. On the surface, being offered friendship after a painful ending sounds like kindness, like someone extending an olive branch rather than disappearing entirely. And to be fair, this offer is rarely made with conscious malice. Most avoidant individuals genuinely believe, in the moment they propose this arrangement, that they are being generous, that friendship represents a caring compromise rather than a strategic retreat. But intention and function are not the same thing, and even a genuinely well-meaning offer of friendship can function, in practice, as a mechanism for avoiding the full weight of loss, both theirs and yours, while still keeping a comforting connection intact. Let's talk about what typically happens to the person receiving this offer, because your experience deserves careful attention here. Accepting friendship immediately following a significant romantic loss requires an almost impossible internal split: continuing to care deeply about someone while somehow simultaneously restraining every romantic or attached feeling that continued closeness naturally reactivates. This split rarely works cleanly in practice. Proximity to someone you loved, even reframed as friendship, tends to keep old attachment systems active, meaning you remain emotionally invested in someone who has functionally reduced their obligations toward you considerably, while potentially still receiving much of the emotional benefit your continued presence provides. Let's talk about the specific asymmetry this arrangement often creates, an asymmetry worth naming plainly, rather than leaving implicit. They typically move through this transition with far less internal conflict than you do, partly because avoidant psychology often includes a genuine capacity to compartmentalize closeness, separating emotional need from romantic obligation more easily than many people can manage. This means friendship for them might genuinely feel comfortable, sustainable, uncomplicated. For you, remaining close to someone you loved, watching them potentially date others, continuing to provide emotional support without romantic reciprocity, often produces exactly the kind of slow, grinding pain that a clean break would have avoided entirely. Let's talk about what this offer often reveals about their own difficulty tolerating loss, because this deserves genuine understanding, rather than simple cynicism. Many avoidant individuals struggle profoundly with clean endings, not because they want the romantic relationship to continue exactly as it was, but because complete separation triggers a different kind of threat entirely: the threat of genuine, irreversible loss. Friendship offers a way to soften this loss, maintaining enough connection that the ending never fully completes itself, allowing them to avoid the full grief that clean separation would otherwise require them to process. This means the friendship offer sometimes serves their own avoidance of loss, just as much as it serves any genuine desire to preserve connection with you specifically. Let's talk about the specific words that often accompany this offer, because language here deserves careful attention. Phrases like, "You mean too much to me to lose completely," or "I just don't think I could handle not having you in my life at all," sound deeply caring on the surface, and the feeling behind them is often genuine. But notice what these phrases center: their difficulty tolerating your absence, rather than any genuine consideration of whether continued closeness actually serves your own healing and well-being. This centering, subtle as it is, reveals something important about whose needs this arrangement primarily serves, even when it gets framed entirely around mutual care and continued connection. Let's talk about what genuine, healthy friendship following a romantic relationship would actually require, because holding this standard clearly helps clarify how far the typical offer usually falls short of it. Genuine post-relationship friendship typically requires significant time apart first, enough space for both people to fully grieve the romantic relationship before attempting any new configuration. It requires both people arriving at a place of genuine emotional neutrality, no longer carrying active romantic attachment or hope for reconciliation. It requires honest, explicit conversation about boundaries, what topics remain off limits, how new romantic partners will be handled, what level of physical or emotional intimacy remains appropriate moving forward. The offer extended immediately following a breakup, without any of this groundwork, rarely resembles genuine friendship. It more often resembles an attempt to skip the difficult work of separation entirely. Let's talk about the specific emotional labor this arrangement frequently requires from you. Labor that deserves clear naming rather than remaining vague and unacknowledged. Maintaining friendship immediately after loving someone romantically often requires you to continuously manage your own feelings in real time, suppressing jealousy, suppressing hope, suppressing grief, all while presenting a calm, supportive facade that allows the friendship to continue functioning smoothly for their benefit. This management is exhausting, and it frequently goes unnoticed by the person receiving its benefit, precisely because managing it well means making the difficulty invisible rather than visible. Let's talk about validation here, because this deserves to be stated plainly. If you have ever agreed to this kind of friendship and found it far more painful than anticipated, that pain does not indicate you are somehow failing at maturity or emotional evolution. It indicates that you are asked to perform an emotional feat that few people can genuinely accomplish immediately following significant romantic loss. Remaining close while somehow not remaining attached. A request that sounds reasonable in theory and proves remarkably difficult in actual lived experience. Let's talk about the specific function this arrangement serves in keeping you available, whether consciously intended this way or not. Friendship maintained immediately after a breakup often functions as a kind of holding pattern, keeping you emotionally invested and readily accessible should they ever want to reconsider the romantic relationship later, without requiring any current commitment on their part toward that possibility. This does not necessarily mean they are deliberately manipulating you into staying available. It often means their own ambivalence about fully letting go gets resolved through your continued presence, resolved for them at your expense, through an arrangement that keeps their options open, while yours quietly narrow the longer you remain in this liminal space. Let's talk about what happens specifically when new romantic interests eventually enter the picture, either theirs or potentially yours, because this moment often reveals the true nature of the friendship arrangement with unusual clarity. Watching them begin dating someone new, while still expecting your continued warm support and friendship, frequently produces intense, confusing pain. Pain that the friendship arrangement never adequately prepared you to navigate. Conversely, if you begin developing romantic interest elsewhere, notice carefully how they respond, whether with genuine warmth and support, or with subtle discomfort, jealousy, or attempts to reassert their own primary place in your emotional life, despite having already relinquished the romantic relationship that would justify that primacy. Let's talk about the specific difference between friendship offered from a place of genuine resolution and friendship offered from a place of unresolved attachment, still seeking an outlet. Genuine resolution typically produces friendship that feels relatively light, uncomplicated, free of romantic tension or lingering hope. Unresolved attachment, by contrast, tends to produce friendship still carrying considerable romantic charge underneath its platonic label, evident through continued flirtation, continued physical affection that exceeds typical friendship boundaries, continued exclusive emotional intimacy that friends typically do not share with each other in the same way former romantic partners might. If the friendship still carries this underlying charge, it has likely not actually resolved into genuine friendship at all, remaining instead a kind of romantic relationship, wearing a different label. Let's talk about what it might mean to decline this offer entirely, at least initially, because this option deserves serious consideration rather than being dismissed as unnecessarily harsh or immature. Requesting complete space, at least for a significant period, does not indicate an inability to eventually maintain a healthy friendship. It often indicates exactly the opposite: sufficient self awareness to recognize that immediate friendship would likely prevent the genuine grieving and healing that eventually makes authentic friendship possible in the first place. Declining the immediate offer protects your own healing process, allowing enough distance for genuine emotional resolution before attempting any new configuration of the relationship. Let's talk about how to communicate this boundary clearly, without needing to justify it extensively or apologize for requiring what you genuinely need during this period. A simple, direct statement, something like needing full space for now in order to heal properly, communicates the boundary clearly, without requiring elaborate explanation or extensive negotiation. Someone who genuinely respects your well being will honor this boundary without excessive pushback, while someone who responds with pressure, guilt, or persistent attempts to convince you otherwise reveals something important about whose needs this proposed friendship was actually designed to serve in the first place. Let's talk about what happens to your own healing process when full separation is chosen instead, at least temporarily. Because this path, while initially harder in some respects, often produces considerably cleaner, more complete healing than the extended, ambiguous alternative. Full separation allows grief to move through its natural process without the interruption that continued contact inevitably creates. It allows attachment to gradually loosen without being continuously reactivated through ongoing proximity. It allows you to build a life increasingly independent of their presence, rather than remaining tethered to a diminished version of the connection you originally valued. Let's talk about whether genuine friendship might eventually become possible further down the road, once sufficient time and genuine healing have occurred on both sides. This possibility remains genuinely open in some cases, though it requires patience considerably longer than most people initially anticipate, often many months rather than the immediate transition typically proposed. If friendship eventually develops after this kind of genuine space, it tends to feel considerably different, lighter, more equal, free of the underlying tension and unequal emotional labor that immediate post breakup friendship typically carries. This later, more genuine friendship, should it develop, bears little resemblance to the arrangement typically offered in the immediate aftermath of the relationship's ending. Let's talk about the specific timing of when this offer typically arrives, because timing itself carries meaningful information worth examining closely. Notice whether the friendship proposal arrives immediately, within the same conversation as the breakup itself, almost as a cushion softening the blow of the ending before it has even fully landed. This immediate timing often indicates the offer functions primarily to manage their own discomfort with delivering a clean, difficult ending, rather than reflecting genuine consideration of what timeline might actually serve both people well. A proposal that requires no reflection, no waiting period, no genuine assessment of readiness on either side deserves particular scrutiny, precisely because its speed suggests reflex rather than considered decision. Let's talk about what typically happens to your own nervous system during the earliest days of attempting this immediate friendship, because the physiological experience here deserves direct acknowledgement. Continued proximity to someone your body and mind have organized around as a primary attachment figure does not simply reset because a new label has been applied to the relationship. Your nervous system likely continues responding to their presence, their voice, their attention, in ways calibrated for romantic partnership rather than platonic friendship, creating a persistent, confusing static beneath whatever calm exterior you might be presenting. This static is not a personal failing. It reflects the simple reality that attachment systems do not reorganize themselves instantly simply because a conversation redefined the relationship's official status. Let's talk about the specific confusion this creates around physical affection, because touch deserves its own careful examination within this dynamic. Habits built during the romantic relationship, casual touch, extended hugs, physical closeness that once felt natural and appropriate, do not automatically disappear once friendship becomes the official framework. This means many post breakup friendships continue including physical affection that would be considered unusual between platonic friends who never dated, creating a confusing hybrid that reinforces romantic and attachment patterns even while both people verbally agree the relationship has changed categories. Noticing whether physical affection has genuinely adjusted to match platonic boundaries, or whether it continues resembling romantic intimacy despite the new label, offers useful information about whether genuine transition has actually occurred. Let's talk about what it means when they continue sharing details typically reserved for romantic partners rather than friends. Details about their emotional struggles, their insecurities, their private fears, delivered with the same intimacy and exclusivity that characterize the romantic relationship itself. This continued emotional exclusivity, even without romantic or physical involvement, often indicates that the relationship has not genuinely transitioned into friendship at all, but has simply relabeled itself while preserving most of its original emotional architecture. Genuine friendship typically involves a broader emotional world, multiple people sharing this kind of intimacy, rather than the concentrated exclusivity more typical of romantic partnership. Let's talk about the specific guilt many people feel when they sense that declining this friendship offer might disappoint or hurt the person proposing it, because this guilt deserves direct, honest examination. There is a common misconception that ending contact entirely represents cruelty, punishment, or an inability to handle change maturely. This misconception deserves correction. Protecting your own healing by declining immediate friendship is not cruelty toward them. It is simply honest acknowledgement of your own genuine limits, limits that deserve respect regardless of how the other person might interpret or feel about your decision. Their potential disappointment at your boundary does not make that boundary unreasonable or unkind. Let's talk about the specific narrative that sometimes develops when someone declines the friendship offer. A narrative where they position themselves as the reasonable, mature party, while framing your need for space as evidence of bitterness or an inability to move forward gracefully. This narrative deserves recognition for what it often represents, a subtle attempt to shift responsibility for the difficulty of the situation onto you, rather than acknowledging that immediate friendship following significant romantic loss represents a genuinely difficult, sometimes impossible request, regardless of who proposes it or how reasonably it gets framed. You are not required to accept this narrative simply because it gets presented confidently or repeatedly. Let's talk about what it reveals when someone becomes notably persistent about maintaining friendship despite your clearly expressed need for space, because persistence here deserves careful interpretation rather than automatic acceptance as evidence of genuine care. Persistent pursuit of continued closeness, despite your explicit request for distance, often indicates that the friendship offer serves a need of theirs that outweighs, at least in that moment, genuine respect for what you have communicated you need. Someone who truly prioritizes your well-being over their own comfort with loss will typically honor a clearly stated boundary, even when doing so disappoints them personally, rather than continuing to push against a limit you have already articulated clearly. Let's talk about the specific way social circles sometimes complicate this entire situation, particularly when mutual friends, shared family connections, or overlapping social environments make complete separation logistically difficult, even when it might be psychologically ideal. In these more complicated circumstances, complete avoidance may not be fully achievable, requiring instead a more careful, deliberate approach to managing necessary contact, while still protecting your own healing as much as possible within these constraints. This might involve clearly defined limits around what topics remain appropriate during necessary interactions, clear boundaries around physical affection or emotional intimacy, even within unavoidable shared social contexts, and continued honest self assessment about whether even this limited contact remains manageable, or whether additional distance becomes necessary despite the social complications involved. Let's talk about the specific relief that sometimes arrives, often unexpectedly, once genuine distance has been maintained for a meaningful period, because this relief deserves acknowledgement as a real, valuable outcome worth anticipating even during the difficult early stages of maintaining that distance. Many people report that the anxiety and confusion characteristic of early separation gradually gives way to a clearer, calmer internal state, one that would have been considerably harder to access had immediate friendship kept old attachment patterns continuously activated. This eventual relief, while not always obvious during the hardest early days, represents genuine evidence that choosing distance, however difficult initially, often serves healing considerably more effectively than immediate, complicated friendship ever could. Let's talk about what it means to grieve not just the romantic relationship itself, but also the specific fantasy of immediate, easy friendship that the initial offer might have represented. A fantasy of remaining close without pain, of preserving connection without cost. This particular grief deserves its own acknowledgement, separate from grieving the romantic relationship itself, because releasing this fantasy, however appealing it initially sounded, represents its own meaningful step toward more realistic, more sustainable healing, one grounded in accurate understanding of what your own nervous system and emotional needs actually require during this particular period, rather than in an idealized vision of effortless transition that rarely matches genuine lived experience. Let's talk about the specific psychological concept of ambiguous loss, because this framework illuminates precisely why immediate post breakup friendship tends to feel so uniquely difficult compared to other forms of loss. Ambiguous loss refers to a kind of grief without clear resolution, where the person or relationship being lost remains present in some form, physically or emotionally accessible, while the actual relationship that once existed has genuinely ended. This kind of loss is considerably harder to process than a clean, complete ending, precisely because the mind struggles to fully grieve something that has not fully disappeared. Immediate friendship following a romantic loss creates exactly this ambiguous condition, keeping the person present while the relationship itself has changed so fundamentally that genuine grief becomes almost impossible to complete cleanly. Let's talk about why clean endings, however painful in the immediate term, often produce healthier long-term outcomes than ambiguous, partial endings do. Complete separation allows grief to follow its natural trajectory, moving through genuine stages of processing without the interruption that continued contact inevitably introduces. Each interaction during an attempted immediate friendship essentially reopens the wound slightly, preventing the kind of consistent healing that uninterrupted time and space typically allows. This does not mean complete separation feels easier in the short term. It often feels considerably harder initially, precisely because it requires facing the full weight of loss all at once, rather than diluting it through continued, if diminished, contact. But this initial difficulty typically resolves into more complete, more genuine healing over time than the alternative provides. Let's talk about what specific self-talk might help during the early days of choosing distance over the offered friendship, because internal narrative matters considerably during this particularly difficult transition period. Rather than framing this choice as losing them entirely, framing it instead as choosing your own healing, as honoring what you genuinely need, rather than what feels socially expected or immediately comfortable, can provide meaningful support during moments when the temptation to reach back out or accept their renewed offer feels particularly strong. This reframing does not eliminate the difficulty of the choice, but it does help anchor that difficulty in genuine self respect, rather than allowing it to feel like unnecessary deprivation or punishment. Let's talk about the specific role that other relationships play in supporting you through this particular transition, because isolation tends to make this already difficult process considerably harder to navigate successfully. Leaning on friends, family, or professional support during this period provides essential alternative sources of connection and validation, reducing the pull toward accepting the offered friendship simply because it represents an available source of continued closeness and attention. Without these alternative sources of support, the pull toward accepting immediate friendship, even when it does not genuinely serve your healing, can become considerably harder to resist, simply because the alternative, complete distance, might otherwise feel unbearably isolating, without other meaningful connection filling that space. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own sense of self-worth throughout this process, because self-worth deserves careful protection during this particularly vulnerable period. Accepting immediate friendship out of fear that declining might mean losing them entirely, or out of belief that maintaining any connection, however painful, is better than none at all, often reflects an underlying belief that your own needs matter less than preserving proximity to them. Challenging this belief directly, recognizing that your own healing and well-being deserve genuine priority, represents an important part of protecting your self-worth throughout this entire transition, regardless of how difficult that protection feels in the immediate moment. Let's talk about the specific way this entire experience, navigated with genuine boundaries rather than immediate acceptance of whatever arrangement gets proposed, ultimately teaches you something valuable about your own capacity for self-advocacy. Successfully asserting your own need for space, even when that assertion disappoints someone you care about, even when it requires tolerating discomfort and uncertainty about how they might respond, represents genuine practice in prioritizing your own well-being over immediate social comfort. This practice, difficult as it is, builds a skill that serves you considerably well in future relationships and future difficult situations, teaching you that your own needs deserve genuine consideration, even when honoring them requires disappointing someone else in the process. Let's talk about what it means when, after sufficient time apart, you begin to notice genuine indifference replacing what was once intense longing or attachment, because this shift represents one of the clearest signs that distance has served its intended purpose. This indifference does not indicate coldness or an inability to ever reconnect meaningfully in the future. It indicates that the attachment system has finally settled, no longer requiring their continued presence in order to feel calm and secure. Reaching this state, however long it takes to develop, represents genuine healing, and it typically requires exactly the kind of sustained distance that immediate friendship would have prevented from ever fully developing. Let's talk about the specific way this dynamic sometimes gets complicated by genuine mutual history that makes complete separation feel like a betrayal of everything shared. Years of memories, inside jokes, mutual understanding built over considerable time together. This complication deserves honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Genuine history does not disappear simply because the romantic relationship ended, and grieving the loss of that shared history, not just the romantic partnership itself, represents its own legitimate layer of this entire process. However, this genuine history does not obligate you to maintain immediate contact in order to honor it. History can be honored through memory and gratitude for what once existed, without requiring continued present-day proximity that actively interferes with your own healing. Let's talk about what it means when they frame the friendship offer specifically around concern for your well-being, suggesting that maintaining connection will somehow help you heal more effectively than complete separation would. This framing deserves particular scrutiny because it positions them as an authority on what your healing genuinely requires, when in reality, only you possess accurate information about what your own internal experience actually needs during this period. Someone genuinely prioritizing your well being would typically defer to your own assessment of what helps or hinders your healing, rather than insisting their preferred arrangement. Continued friendship represents the objectively correct path for you specifically to follow. Let's talk about the specific exhaustion of constantly monitoring your own emotional reactions during interactions with someone you are attempting to maintain friendship with immediately after loving them romantically. This constant self monitoring, checking whether your response seems appropriately platonic, suppressing any reaction that might reveal continued romantic feeling, represents significant ongoing labor that rarely gets acknowledged or appreciated by the person benefiting from your careful management of your own internal experience. This labor, sustained over time, often produces a particular kind of fatigue, distinct from ordinary tiredness, a depletion that comes specifically from continuously performing composure you may not genuinely feel. Let's talk about what genuine self-compassion looks like, specifically during moments when maintaining the boundary of distance feels particularly difficult, when loneliness or continued longing makes reaching back out feel almost irresistible. Self-compassion here does not mean abandoning the boundary the moment it becomes uncomfortable to maintain. It means acknowledging honestly how difficult this particular choice is, without judging yourself harshly for finding it difficult, while still choosing, repeatedly if necessary, to honor the boundary that ultimately serves your longer-term healing over the shorter-term relief that reaching back out might temporarily provide. Let's talk about the specific way this entire situation, handled with genuine self-protection rather than immediate accommodation of their preferred arrangement, ultimately reflects a broader shift in how you relate to your own needs within relationships generally. Learning to prioritize your own healing over someone else's comfort with loss, even when that person genuinely cares about you and means well in their proposal, represents significant growth applicable far beyond this single situation. This growth extends into every future relationship where your own needs might conflict with someone else's preferences, providing you with practiced capacity to advocate for yourself, even when doing so feels uncomfortable or socially difficult in the moment.